Just wanted to make sure there was no catastrophe later. Thank you, Doug. Good morning, church. How do you listen to music these days? When I was coming of age, we listened to music on CDs. Little silver, flat, 6-inch disc with a whopping capacity of 10 songs. You would keep them, you would buy these and you'd keep them at home in your music collection. It would be on a shelf in those little jewel cases that always broke. And you would have them at home on your shelf, arranged by genre and then artist. Maybe that was just me. Except your top 10 or 20 CDs wouldn't be on the shelf. The cases would be on the shelf, but you have your CDs in your CD wallet. And if you don't remember what a CD wallet was, it was like, those 5-star binders you get in high school, those zippered binders? It was like that, but for each page was a sleeve that you put a CD into. And so you could carry it around. You could put it in your glove box with your owner's manual and your stack of napkins from Wendy's. Or if you were like me, you would put it in your backpack. I was a student. You'd put it in your backpack, this fat pouch full of CDs, along with your Discman. And if you've not had the pleasure of using a Discman, picture headphones attached to a manhole cover. It was so big, this giant circular device. It opened up like a clamshell, and you'd put your CD in, and it wasn't rechargeable. And if you shook it, the CD would skip, and so it had anti-shock mode. But you had to feed it AA batteries, and when it was in anti-shock mode, the batteries would last like 40 minutes. And so you had to carry your CD wallet and your giant Discman and your headphones and your AA batteries, and so if you were like me, your backpack didn't even have room for your school stuff in it. So we've moved on, most of us, from CDs, and if you haven't moved on from CDs, I need to tell you it's time. We've moved on from CDs, and we've moved on in a couple of different directions. They gave us MP3 music files and then AAC music files, digital music that you could download. They gave us the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket, they said. We said, amazing. And now the technology has advanced, and now, so I've got, we've got streaming digital music services. I got Spotify on here. I pay a monthly subscription, and it's right, if I've got an internet connection, it's there. I don't even have to carry an extra device. Like, we were impressed when they said, we'll put all your music in your pocket. Now they're like, we'll put all the music in your pocket. Every song, I've got it, it's with me all the time. It's amazing. So we moved on from CDs, and we moved forward. We've also moved backward. And so this is a turntable, a record player, okay? And this is a record, right? This has music on it. And you put this on there and it spins around and it plays your music. This is how people listen to music, 50, 60 years ago. And right? But it's also how people listen to music now. This is really interesting. People are moving back to vinyl, and so here, I'll show you this. In 2006, in the United States, 900,000 vinyl records were sold. In 2018, that number was 16.8 million. Vinyl records are getting really popular. In 1989, Sony stopped producing vinyl records in-house. No one was buying them. But in 2018, they bought a record-cutting lathe and installed it in their Tokyo office. It's an interesting phenomenon because this thing, this is huge. Like, forget about your backpack. This thing's like, it's probably 20 pounds, and These records are giant, and you have to actually, if you want to use this format, you have to actually arrange your furniture so that there's a place for this. But it's becoming really popular. Now let me ask you a question. Is our spiritual life more like streaming digital music or more like vinyl records? We're kicking off the fall with a 3-week sermon series called Belong. And we're all in this place now in September where, maybe you're new to the church, you're checking us out, maybe it's your first week here, welcome. Or maybe you've been here for a while, but we're all in a place where we're saying, okay, as we reestablish our rhythm, what's it going to look like in the coming season for us? And what we want to do is invite you, as you're establishing your rhythms, to not go to church, but to belong to church. To invest simply but deeply in the faith community. And so we want to invite you to invest in three key areas. Sunday gatherings, we'll talk about today. Next week, Daryl will preach about life groups, and in 2 weeks, Sarah will preach about volunteer teams. And we want to ask you, we want to invite you to connect deeply in those 3 areas as we move into the fall season. So today we're going to talk about this, about our Sunday gatherings. What are we doing here? What is this all about? Doug already read our scripture passage for today from the book of Hebrews. 2,000 years ago, there was a group of Christians who were born Jewish, and they converted to Christianity, and they were scattered around the Roman Empire. And we call them the Hebrews, which used to be the name of the Jewish nation. And we have, and somebody wrote a sermon and addressed it to them, and they wrote it down, and it's the book of Hebrews in the Bible. We don't know who wrote it, but we have it, and it's pretty awesome. And we do know a couple of things about the Hebrews. Okay, 2 things. The first thing we know is that an essential part of how they practiced their faith was gathering. It was getting in a room together. It was embodying their faith in time and space together with other believers. So Acts 2:46, for instance, says they worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity. Now that's talking about the early Jewish Christian Jerusalem church, so a different group than the Hebrews, but related. And the evidence is that that was the pattern for all of the first century Christian groups, that they had this practice, this central practice that they would meet together. Okay, they would have a large group meeting in the temple. If they were away from Jerusalem, they would meet in another public meeting space in their city. And they would have a large group meeting with all the other Christians in their city, which wouldn't have been that many, for prayer and teaching and worship and community. They would do that once a week. And then they also had smaller meetings that took place during the week, possibly every day, in people's homes throughout the city. And those were less formal, but they were still intentional, spiritual moments. It included the Lord's Supper, which we'll talk about later. And so they had this big group meeting, and that was kind of the high point of their week. That was really important. And then they had this other really important practice of gathering together in smaller groups in community to do life together. You might even call it like a life group. There you go, Daryl. I teed it up for you. And so that's the first thing we know, that an essential part of how they lived their faith was this embodying it together, getting in a room together. The second thing we know about the Hebrews is that they lived through a time of very difficult persecution. So we're in Hebrews 10 here. A little bit later in the same chapter, it says this: Think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful even though it meant terrible suffering. Sometimes you were exposed to public ridicule and were beaten. And sometimes you helped others who were suffering the same things. You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail. And when all you owned was taken from you, you accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So the author of Hebrews clearly knows the Hebrews and knows their story, and part of their story includes some really difficult suffering on account of their faith. Now based on those verses and some other evidence within Hebrews and some other evidence outside of Hebrews, scholars are able to make a pretty good guess that Hebrews was written right around the year 66. Now, I'll tell you why that's significant. In the year 64, there was a great fire in the city of Rome. 2/3 of the city burned over the course of 6 days. And the rumor was that the emperor at the time, Nero, it's a bad dude, the rumor was that he had ordered the fire to be set deliberately because he wanted to clear ground to build himself a new palace. And the Senate had rejected his proposal to do this. So that was the rumor. Now, we don't know if that's what happened. But what we do know from the Roman historian Tacitus is that this suspicion would not die. And so to remove suspicion from himself, Nero pointed the finger at Christians. Christians were already a misunderstood group that a lot of people thought were weird and didn't trust them. And so Nero said, it was the Christians. It was an easy sell. The public was outraged, and so Nero, to help sell this thing, Nero launched a state-sponsored extermination campaign against the first century Christians. It had never been easy to be a Christian, but now the full force of the Roman Empire was directed at the Christians. And so that's 64, and this is probably around 66, and you can see he's saying, yeah, you guys, I know you're right in the thick of it. Some of you have been beaten and imprisoned. You've had your possessions taken away. We know that other Christians paid for their faith with their lives during this time. And so one of the things that you'll actually find in Hebrews is one of the most common words is endure, or endurance. That again and again the author of Hebrews is writing to them to say, look, Jesus is so good that despite this hard thing you're going through, endure, don't walk away. Don't give up. So we know two things about the Hebrews. They had a habit of meeting together, and they lived in the midst of persecution. And so the writer of Hebrews says this thing in our passage in verse 25. And let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do. That's not a throwaway line. That's really significant. What he's saying is, look, Hebrews, the fact is that the heat is a little bit too hot right now. And so some Christians are giving up. Some Christians are retreating from embodying their faith together. Right? And who could blame them? Who could blame them for retreating into a faith that is private, that is just me and Jesus, that's in my brain only? I'm not gonna do this as a public thing. I'm not gonna do this together with other Christians. It's hard to avoid the shackles and the whips when you're getting together in a big gathering with all the Christians in your city once a week. But he says, let's not neglect our meeting together. Keep gathering. Which brings us back to my question. Is our spiritual life more like streaming digital music or more like vinyl records? If you if you asked if you ask someone why they use Apple Music or Spotify, you're going to get a pretty simple answer. It's cost effective. It's low barrier to entry. It's convenient. It's already in my pocket. It connects to my car, right? You ever, if you have someone in your life who collects vinyl records, do you ever ask them why? I know a handful of hipsters who are into vinyl records. And so I was curious, why this? I wanted to find out, so I phoned them to ask. They didn't pick up, so I texted them. And within moments, I got back, like from everyone, I got back paragraphs. And here's what they said. They said that there's something intangible about this tangible experience. They said that there's something special about it, about the intentionality, about the ritual, about the physicality. You walk into a record store, you smell the smell of the records, you say hi to the aging hippie behind the counter. You flip through the records for 45 minutes, you find that record. You take it to the counter, you pay for it, you go home and you feel it in the bag as you're carrying it home. You're excited. You get to your house, you make yourself a cup of coffee. You sit down. These guys don't have kids, by the way. You sit down in your living room next to your turntable, right? And you take it out of the bag. You open up the turntable, and you take out your new record. You feel the grooves. And you set it down on here, right? And you put the needle on it. It starts to spin. It's not plugged in, but it starts to spin hypnotically. You watch it spin, and you sit in your chair with your coffee. You sit there, and you look at the album art. You read the liner notes. Halfway through, you flip the thing over, and you take a chunk of your afternoon to just be with that record. And they say that the sound quality is better. People debate that sometimes. I don't know. But they say that digital music, when you turn music digital, that you lose some of the sonic information, and so that the sound is less full, less warm. It's a little bit thin. And so you're actually, they say, getting better sound quality from a record. But more than that, it's this embodied, intentional ritual. And they say there's no replacing that. And yes, you're listening to the same song that's on Spotify, but it's not the same experience. It's richer. It's deeper. There's a connection. So in 2016, a book came out called The Revenge of Analog by David Sachs. And he talks about this. He talks about vinyl records, print books, board games, and film cameras. And he talks about how there's an easy digital equivalent to all of these, often lower cost, often easier, but that actually he argues that millennials and Generation Z are going to become a post-digital generation. Because we've lived our lives with digital things for so long, right? And it's gotten so good. And it should be satisfying and fulfilling and amazing. And yet we're finding that just like listening to a junky digital recording of a song, it's thin and tinny. It's all treble and no bass. It doesn't feel like we're really experiencing it. That this disengaged, disembodied, distracted way that we experience the world leaves us feeling kind of untethered, leaves us feeling like we're unsatisfied. So here's what he says. He says, surrounded by digital, we now crave experiences that are more tactile and human-centric. We want to interact with goods and services with all our senses, and many of us are willing to pay a premium to do so, even if it is more cumbersome and costly than its digital equivalent. Even if it's more cumbersome and costly than its digital equivalent, there's something about the embodied, tangible, public, intentional experience of life that is irreplaceable, that is worth going out of our way for. The same is true, says the writer of Hebrews, for our spiritual lives. Let us not neglect meeting together. There's people with swords looking for us, but it's irreplaceable. I heard a podcast this summer where a guy was telling his story of leaving church. Grew up Christian and had left the church. And for a lot of reasons that were very valid. But one thing he said, I think, I felt like, I wish I could have a conversation with him about that. He said church used to be based on the premise that someone was going to get up and say something, so we need to go hear it. But now, people are saying things all over the place. You can podcasts, TED Talks, audiobooks, whatever. It's easy to get your hands on. Music, like we have great music, but you can get music without coming here. And so he said, why would I practice my spirituality in a room with a bunch of other people? Why not be free of that in the 21st century? And he's right if all we're doing here is 5 songs and a sermon. He's right if all that we're doing here is delivering content. If that's all this is, absolutely, let's turn it all into zeros and ones and ship it out. But is it possible that there's some intangible something that goes on when we get in a room together, in intentional space, embodying our faith together? The very story of Christianity is a story of embodying our spirituality together. We're in Hebrews 10 here. Hebrews 1 says this. These are the first 2 verses of Hebrews. It says, long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. And now in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. He says what God did for centuries was send us messages. He sent people to say, hey, here's what God says. Here's what God wants you to do. But now in these final days, the climactic moment of the story of God and humanity is God speaking to us through his Son, through Jesus. John 1:14 famously says, so the Word, this is talking about Jesus, so the Word became human and made his home among us. It's talking about the Son of God there, the Word. And there's a whole bunch of theological freight on that word. But think about a word. What is a word? It's powerful, but in some ways it's disembodied and detached, right? The Word became human, literally became flesh, and made his home among us. See, the very story of Christianity is a story of embodying a spiritual reality together with human beings. Wrap your head around the fact that God had access to every format for relating to human beings. Wrap your head around the fact that God can and has inspired prophets to come and say, this is what God says. That God can and has inspired the writing of Scripture. That God can and has acted powerfully, doing miraculous signs so that we would know something about him or see something about him. And yet the ultimate format that God chose for the divine-human relationship was his physical presence with us. God didn't consider the God-humanity relationship to be fulfilled until he got in a room with us. God didn't consider the divine-human relationship to be fulfilled until he drank new wine with us at a wedding feast. Until he spread mud on our eyes and healed our blindness. Until he sat with us in a boat as a storm rocked it. Until he stood with us weeping at the tomb of a freshly sealed, or at the opening of a freshly sealed tomb. Until he washed the dirt off of our feet. Until he broke bread with us. Until he was wounded and bled for us. And so it makes all the sense in the world that when we retreat, when we neglect meeting together, that we retreat into a private and disembodied and distracted and disengaged faith, that somehow it feels thin and unsatisfying. The Christian story itself tells us we need to embody our spiritual reality together. And so the writer of the Hebrews says, and if you read the whole passage, it says, Jesus has opened a life-giving way for us to enter into the holy place. He says, let us spur one another on to love and good deeds. He says, let's encourage each other. He's saying in that passage, let's not neglect meeting together, because we're going to be able to go deep with each other and go deep with God when we do. And it's costly at times, it's inconvenient at times, but it's irreplaceable. So we're going to move into communion. And so I want to call up the band. Ushers, get ready. I'll call you up in a sec. Jesus modeled for us this idea of embodying our spiritual reality together.